So our first speaker is Leonie Smith. Leonie Smith is a researcher in philosophy at the University of Manchester, and she holds the analysis studentship for 2020 and 21. She works in social philosophy with a cross-sectional focus on political theory, ethics, global justice, social epistemology, and social metaphysics. In 2020, she was awarded a Faculty of Humanities Outstanding Teaching Award by student nomination. In 2019, she was awarded the University of Manchester Distinguished Achievement Award and the Faculty of Humanities Award for Postgraduate Researcher of the Year. In 2018, she was awarded the Departmental Teaching Prize. In 2017, she received the inaugural Essay Prize Award for of the International Society of Social Ontology. And today, the title of her talk is "What are the agents of the press and what are the agents of social media?"
Thank you very much. It's nice to hear that I sound quite good actually from that. So thank you so much. So I just want to start by saying, since it's the first talk, thank you so much to Tufan and Bill for organising this, and everybody who's responding, and particularly to Dilara, who's going to respond to me after this. I'm going to present on what are the agents of the press and what are the agents of social media. I'll actually be spending a lot more time on the agents of the press, and that's partly because I actually think that what I'm saying about social media is even more exploratory, and also because I have some other work coming out with a co-author on that. So this might be the place to focus on the sort of side of the press a bit. I'm not sure how much I'm going to say is controversial or how much it's actually just people will just go, yeah, this is absolutely fine. So I'll find out what you think as I go through it. So first up, but basically what I'm going to be arguing is this, that within democratic states, I'm just going to argue first up that we should take seriously the claim that newspaper agents of the press are what's known as the fourth estate, or the democratic agent in a state. And specifically, this is going to imply that agents of the press are either constitutive parts of a collective, which I'm going to explain a bit later on, or else they're just standard corporate agents, and we shouldn't be worrying about them at all as agents of democracy, which comes with a whole different set of expectations. And then second, and more speculatively, I'm going to be saying something about social media agents, and saying that they're on their way to becoming, I think, a new type of democratic agent within the state. So that's basically what I'm doing today. But before I get started, you might think, well, why care about any of this? Or you might think this is all very intuitive, but let me give some reasons to think about that. And the reason I think we should care about what kind of agent we're dealing with when we talk about the print press and when we talk about social media is perhaps unsurprisingly because of claims about the scale and severity of harms that can be caused by them en masse or individually. So, for example, when we think about the case of the print press media, we have, for example, Lani Watson, who I'll mention a bit later on, arguing that the media are responsible for epistemic duties towards the general population, and that we can violate those duties. So we can have massive epistemic rights violations. And I'll say a bit more about an example of that later. You also have me, slightly more controversially elsewhere, arguing that, again, in the case of the print press media, the press are responsible for prejudicial reporting in ways that undermine the actual personhood status of certain groups of people. So these are massive, wide-scale harms caused by the print press when they collectively act together. And then in the case of social media, we have all kinds of claims. So we have claims, and this is why there's been a lot of debate recently about what regulations should be put in place when it comes to social media. But we have claims that they cause major epistemic harm via the cumulative actions of all the people who participate in social media. So when enough people like and share that ex-president of America's tweets over time, this can cause the whole epistemic environment to become polluted, leading to insurrections at the Capitol in the US. Or we can just have things like more ordinary conspiracy tales getting spread around very easily, and information interfering with elections through Facebook and so on, and echo chambers and epistemic bubbles forming. So you have this idea that you have these large scale harms that are being caused by the print press and by social media in some way. and I'm using cause very loosely here, but that they're involved in that. And so these harms all have, as we see, real world material impacts. They matter enormously. But the challenge with all of this is quite often who to hold responsible, certainly in an ethical sense, certainly in a moral sense for these things that have happened. Now, if you're somebody who just is happy to accept various claims about responsibility to do with, well, if you have the ability to stop something, you should stop something and all those kinds of things, that's fine. And you might not be too concerned about what kinds of agents are involved. But we do find that a lot of people think that in order to be morally responsible for these mass collective harms, you had to have had some form of agential role in bringing them about. So this is true even, I think, if we think there are other sources that are non-causal for preventing or redressing harms that happen. It's a lot easier to just start with the agential parties and understand what they've done. And to do that, we need to understand what kinds of agents they are. So I think that understanding what the agents of social media and the press actually are, and how we should categorize them, might then give us some answers to this as to whether or not they're the kind of parties that might be responsible for bearing duties relating to the harms caused by the print press and by social media, loosely construed, without having to rely on other, perhaps more contested sources of duty. So that's basically why I think this is worth talking about. So I'm going to start with the print press agents. I'll be spending a lot more time on the print press agents side of things, because I actually think perhaps, well, we'll find out what people think about this, but I think perhaps against intuition, I actually think it's harder to hold the print press to account for the broader epistemic and other forms of harms they cause, and I'll say why in a bit. So I'm going to basically be suggesting that the group agents of the press, so individual newspapers and their online variants, are democratic agents, and that they bear duties related to that role, but that these roles in their instances, so when we talk about each individual press agent, those roles don't actually sufficiently ground responsibility for the wide-scale collective harms we're talking about here. However, I do think there's a sense in which they form a further genuinely structured collective agent, and that's what I'm going to argue for. So overall, I'm not going to argue this point in particular, and perhaps in this group I don't need to too much anyway. I'm not going to argue that there are such things as group agents. I'm going to take it that there are. I'm going to say that the print press, each individual newspaper, so if we talk about the UK, like the Guardian or the Sun newspaper and their online version or something like that, I'm going to say that if anything is a group agent of some kind, then each of these is a group agent, however you cash that out, and however you think we should then split up the duties within that group, whether you think it's going to be the editor who's responsible or whether it's going to be spread amongst them. I'm just going to take the assumption that they are corporate agents. So at least in principle, a newspaper is the kind of thing that is fit to bear duties. And we certainly seem to think so. We do hold newspapers to account for the actions of their journalists, for example, in frequent cases. But more importantly, I think the type of agent that members of the print press agents are agents of democracy. So this is not a new claim, but I think it's worth thinking about, because I think we often throw it around, and I'm not sure that we're grasping what makes them an agent of democracy in all cases. But they basically, they fulfill the role of this fourth estate, or they are a vital democratic body within democratic states, or emerging states that are trying to be democratic or trying to hold on to democracy. So as the European Convention on Human Rights argues there, so to quote there, ensuring a free, independent and pluralistic media based on freedom of information and expression, they say, is a core element for a healthy democracy. And this right should be respected whatever the circumstances. They actually do have a few caveats on that, but in practice, those are very limited circumstances when you could interfere with the freedom of the press. And what they mean by this, I think, is that the press effectively fulfills a powerful epistemic role in society. The press as democratic agents provide a vital epistemic function or set of functions. They enable the citizenry to gain access to information which affects their and others' lives. They speak truth to power on behalf of the citizens of the state, or well, this is the idea anyway. They speak up when governments and powerful entities are in the wrong, and they investigate the truth on behalf of all citizens within the state. So here you've got Leveson. So this is Leveson, who was basically in charge of a huge inquiry within the UK into the British press, and he was talking about regulation and what restrictions should be placed on them. But here's just a quote he summed up after looking at all the evidence that people presented. He basically said, the existence of a press with such significant power to be a megaphone to shift public opinion is a potential antidote to the dominance of big business and government. So when we think about the democratic role, it is this idea that they can stand up to power in some way on behalf of the people in the state, so they can fulfill this role. And as a result, they're effectively enabling citizens' epistemic rights, whatever these are taken to be, or they're protecting their right to know the truth, or their right to be able to speak truth to power, something like that. And so members of democratic institutions and the print press specifically are all granted important and powerful claim rights against the state when they're in these positions. And these rights, I suggest, are granted in order to enable them to fulfill this important democratic role. And as we see, basically the press, governments, international bodies and citizens actually all seem pretty sure about this democratic role in practice. So I don't think this is a controversial claim when you actually look at what people believe and what they say to defend the way that things act. And you can look at things like the Editors' Code in the UK, for example, and what they're saying. You can look at what the UN says about the freedom of the press and their role in a working democracy. Okay, so I think I've sort of dwelled on that a bit, but I'm just trying to get across. And this isn't just a role in principle. This is what people argue and act as if we have to allow the press to have freedom in order to do. This role means we might place some restrictions on press freedom, so for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, so we might have slander laws and so on. But in practice, there's widespread caution over what form those restrictions should take. So states shouldn't enact criminal proceedings and or imprisonment against journalists and media outlets who defame and so on. Media outlets shouldn't feel they have to change their editorial policy through fear of legal proceedings and all that kind of thing. Because this would prevent them from fulfilling this democratic role. That's the claim. And in actual fact, I think this protection of press freedom is absolutely worth defending. It's more than worth defending. Freedom of the press is a huge deal. And we see that things go horribly wrong when the press are not free all over the world. This is not a bad thing. So basically the agents of the press are collective, individually, they are group agents of democracy. A bit confusing, I'm saying individually, but as news outlets, they are all specific agents of democracy. However, despite this kind of widespread recognition of the press's role as agents of democracy, we quite often seem, I think, strangely reluctant to really follow through on the implications of their role. So the press has rights relating to their freedom to publish as agents of democracy who are fulfilling that role. But logically, I think this means they also have correlatory duties, just as other democratic agents like members of parliament do, for example, or members of the justice system. You get granted the right to certain things in order to fulfill your role, but it comes with duties. And I think the scope of these agential duties should not be subject to the whims of public or parliamentary opinion, precisely because they need this freedom that we've talked about. They need freedom from state or government interference. And you can't really preserve that if we grant public opinion to any sitting parliament. So if we give the sort of whoever's in charge of the state the power to just change the press's duties as they see fit, or to change their rights as they see fit, this is a dangerous thing to do for the reasons that we've said. The press needs to be free. And so the least contested grounds for the scope of press duties is, I think anyway, that they are the duties that are necessary to enable them to actually perform their epistemic function in delivering these certain epistemic goods, or securing the epistemic rights, if you're Lionel Watson and you think in those terms, of the citizenry. So press agents have the duty to at least not undermine their own role in terms of delivering epistemic rights on behalf of the citizenry. So it would, for example, undermine the press's democratic role if they acted in ways if an individual news agent acted in a way which prevented a plurality of voices from being heard, then they couldn't be fulfilling the role of enabling citizen voices to be heard. If they were actively preventing that, that would be an undermining of their specific role. If they obstructed the truth from being communicated, or if they willfully and actively misled the citizenry to a significant or impactful extent on important matters. These would be things that they would do which could undermine their actual role. So their duties are not to do those things. And this makes them then non-arbitrarily established epistemic duties, perhaps of the type that Watson's thinking of in this quote here, when she says that the media has a duty of some kind. So she says that the mainstream media exists to provide those living in democratic societies with an accurate and informative representation of societal and political issues and events. And if we have this duty to not undermine this role, then the media has a duty to provide the conditions under which individuals can form justified true beliefs. I'm not going to, I don't want to get too attached to Watson's claims here, and there's lots we could question about the specific wording of that, but that's perhaps some kind of idea behind it, that press agents have the duty to at least not undermine their own role in terms of delivering epistemic rights on behalf of the citizenry. Okay, so far so good. But what this means, of course, is that if distinct press agents all bear these duties, then they should be able to, in principle, be held liable for violations of those duties. They might even be held responsible in court for committing something like the thing that we have. So in the UK, we have this idea of misconduct in public office. So in the CPS, so MPs, for example, under a very strict set of criteria can be taken to court for misconduct in their role as democratic agents, as members of parliament. So arguably, we should be thinking about the press in the same kind of way, that there would be conditions under which they could be held responsible as democratic agents for misconduct in their role as democratic agents. But as I've already said earlier, you don't want a situation in which they could literally be taken to court and potentially held criminally liable for absolutely all and anything they print. The idea would have to be that for a case to even be heard in court, there'd have to be evidence of something like willful neglect to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder without reasonable excuse or justification. So not just a casual mistake here, or a little bit of bad reporting here, or an opinion that went too far over there, or something like that. You'd have to be willful to a significant degree, and it would have to not be done without good excuse or justification. And effectively, what I would say is that news outlets who don't think they have these kinds of duties, well, they're not really agents of the press. They are just ordinary corporate agents. And I'm going to just put those people to one side and say they have to be dealt with separately. They're just ordinary corporate actors. And while this might free them of these epistemic duties, it's also going to deprive them then of the freedom that comes with being an agent of the democratic state. So as corporate actors, entertainment companies or something like that. So like Fox News, I think in America has been recategorized as an entertainment company, for example. And I think that's quite right, because they're not fulfilling their democratic role, and they seem to want to take that role on. They shouldn't be given the freedoms that come with that. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So we should take seriously, that's the first thing really, we should take seriously the idea that press agents are democratic agents, so they have an actual democratic role. And that should come with wide-ranging rights to do certain things, and it should also come with correlatory duties with regard to fulfilling those things. Okay, and that's the first claim. So now let's just say a bit more about collective harm and what the whole problem is that I was alluding to at the beginning. So the issue that we have is that the actions of agents of the press, journalists and news stories can lead to collective harms. And this is true, I'm going to say in a bit, even when those actions aren't necessarily harmful. Now, we can start off by trying to say something like, the press should not be epistemically bad, full stop. But I think that's a really bad starting point to take. First of all, because if we're going to try and say, well, we should be able to hold press agents to full account every time they print anything misleading, they should be taken to court as having breached their democratic duty. That just seems like it's going to hinder the ability of the press to try and act reasonably. They will make mistakes, they will occasionally get things wrong, and they will overreach sometimes, and they need to be given the freedom to do that if they're going to be able to perform their democratic role. But there's something still that I think we do need to say about them. To give an example of how these collective harms can come about, in the first instance, let's look at this case of Brexit and asylum seeking. So quite often, I think what we do want to say is that individually, a lot of actions that press agents take don't actually seem to be that harmful or even harmful at all. They could be going to be seen as an epistemically positive role. For example, members of the press do things to try and set the agenda, to bring things to the public attention, to focus on things. And this has an impact. So individual press agents might, for example, choose to focus on something like during the Brexit negotiations, which happened in the UK, where this for those who are not entirely familiar, Brexit basically the process of the UK leaving the European Union. There was a vote on it. It's the whole thing a few years back. And during that time, the press played an important role in setting the agenda of what things were talked about. Now, unfortunately, they all sort of focused on very similar things, or a lot of them focused on very similar things. Agenda setting at the level of individual agents can contribute to wider epistemic harm, but it's also something that's necessary they have to do. Now, in the case of Brexit, you can see the impact that the collective of news agents had. If you look at the sort of opinion, that's just gone mad. The opinion polls that were coming out. So in June 2016, right at the height of Brexit, when they did a survey, they did these regular, they call them YouGov surveys, to find out what people think are the most important issues in society. In June 2016, 56% of people said that immigration and asylum was one of the most important issues. Okay, but then once we got to July 2016, post-Brexit, and the press started to report less and less on specifically immigration and asylum, started to move much more towards the EU negotiations themselves, you saw a drop in public opinion thinking that immigration and asylum was one of the most important issues. It dropped to 46%. And then by December 2019, so a few years after all of this, you see a huge drop, because the press has been, since 2016, since Brexit happened, the UK press has been largely focusing on the European negotiations. It's saying was till December 2019, before COVID became kind of the big story. So there you see that only 20% of the public thought that immigration and asylum was one of the most important issues. So you can see how the press has the ability to influence the public agenda. I can't prove causation, correlation isn't necessarily causation, but we see this corresponding with the press focusing less and less on those kinds of headlines and stories in the UK. So in itself, you know, there's nothing actually wrong with an individual news agent setting an agenda. That's actually what they should be doing. But you can see how cumulatively they can cause the public to be influenced. So now, whether it causes harm or not is going to depend on what they're saying. In the case of the UK, a lot of the news agents and press agents were saying very negative things. So this is, unfortunately, the name's just cropped off there, but this is Zaid Raed Al Hussein, who was formerly the UN ambassador on human rights. And he says, asylum seekers and migrants have day after day for years on end, this is in the UK press, been linked to rape, murder, diseases such as HIV and TB, theft, and almost every conceivable crime and misdemeanor imaginable in front page articles and two-page spreads, in cartoons, editorials, even on the sports pages of almost all the UK's national tabloid newspapers. And he was saying this around about 2015, 2016, I think. So we've got a combination of agenda setting, and then it turns out that a lot of the newspapers were all saying very similar things as well, and those things were not very positive things. And this had a huge impact. So this did create a kind of collective impact that we might think is harmful. And you can see this reported in Holloway and colleagues here, that the UK is among the European Union countries with technically the most positive attitudes towards immigration. So we have a huge distinction in the UK between this idea of legal and illegal immigrants, which is not the best distinction, but it says Britain's held the most negative attitudes towards refugee assistance. So what you see happening is a situation in which at the level of individual agents. Now, in this case, they were doing, many of them were doing what one might think are epistemically bad things. They were saying very unpleasant things about asylum seekers, for example, to try and influence how the vote went in Brexit. But it's the cumulative impact that's caused a collective problem that Watson would categorise as an epistemic rights violation. So she, in her paper, argues that the British public were prevented from getting access to the truth due to the collective actions of the press when it came to Brexit. So they had their rights violated. The press were not fulfilling what I would call their democratic role. And in my account, then this also led to an erosion of the personhood status, potentially, of asylum seekers. So there's a lot going on at collective harm level. But the general point here is really that they were, at the time, they were fulfilling legitimate functions. And even when they do, even when they do these things and they are perhaps individually epistemically bad, we can't say that these acts on their own are sufficient, I think, to be able to undermine a whole subpopulation's personhood status or to undermine the entire citizenry's epistemic rights. So if you're one press agent and you print stories about Brexit, say, which are misleading, or you don't print the full truth, or you don't print a range of voices about whether we should have more people welcomed under asylum policies and so on. If you do that, well, you might think that's not a great thing, but that's not going to be enough on its own to violate the epistemic rights of the entire citizenry to understand the truth. Because what you need is that a huge proportion of press agents are all doing the same thing. So we can't really go even to the Sun, who printed some of the most egregious headlines. You can't really go to the Sun newspaper and say, well, you violated the epistemic rights of the entire citizenry, because they'll say, well, hang on, we just put out our editorial opinion. It was other people were welcome to put forward their own opinions. We didn't do something on this kind of scale. So you've got this kind of problem here, I think. And here I've been talking about that sort of negative thing, but you can see how this doesn't have to be an actual harmful act. There are plenty of things that completely legitimate, as I say, setting an editorial policy, putting forward different perspectives, deciding who you print and who you don't print. There's nothing wrong with saying, actually, we're not going to interview politicians or something. We're just going to focus on these kinds of things. But if every newspaper does that, that can lead to a problem. So it's true even when the action's not necessarily harmful when taken individually. And so here's Steph Collins. So it'd be nice to see her smiling face at this point, but she talks about this idea, as many people do, of responsibility gaps. And I think this is what's going on here, because the epistemic harms produced by the activities of agents of the print press come about through cumulative activities of those agents in the relative absence of alternative voices. I think a lot of people would balk at the idea that just being part of some causal chain is sufficient for full moral outcome responsibility for what everybody collectively has done. And I'm not going to argue for that here, but I think because there are other controversies with that, we shouldn't be relying on that to claim that these news agents have this responsibility. And so the agents of the press are only going to have duties for the harms produced by their collective activity if they also have some kind of further responsibility for what the group of press agents brings about. And this arguably causes a problem when thinking about who's held responsible morally for the harms that have come out, the collective harms. So as Steph says, Stephanie Collins says, responsibility gaps occur when we have a pre-theoretic intuition or equivalently a pre-reflective gut reaction that a particular collective, so in this case the press, bears a particular kind of responsibility, yet we can't really justify or vindicate that pre-theoretic intuition upon engaging in principled reflection. And I think that something like this seems to be the case with regard to widespread severe epistemic harm and the print press media. These instances are certainly produced by their combined actions, but the print press agents taken on their own don't seem to be fit to bear the responsibility having caused those massive harms. And so the question becomes, is there any agent responsible for causing these big collectively produced epistemic harms, particularly when they come about through the legitimate actions of specific agents of the press? And I'm going to argue that yes, there might be, but that's something that you may or may not agree with at this point. So before I do say that, one thing I will say is that, of course, you could think, as many people do, as I sort of alluded to this earlier, that duties don't come from causal chains at all. Actually, who bears a moral duty can be related to all kinds of things, like beneficence or a basic ability to prevent something, to be able to prevent something, and so on. What I'm getting at here, and what I'm trying to do in this talk and this paper, is really try and avoid any of those things, because they are contested claims, and they often rely on other duties to collectivise and rely on greater demands. So I'm not going to pursue them here. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think they're sources of duties, but I think that what we're looking for is what's the most principled grounds for duties. And if you have agential causally related moral duties, that's something that a lot more people will accept. And I think it's not just that I think these can be contested. I think the reason in particular we should be careful when it comes to the press about talking about, well, because this press agent can do this or could do this. I think it's even harder to build a case when it comes to things like the democratic agents of the press, because we don't want to get involved. We don't want to start to become involved, I think, in requesting unacceptable or unpalatable blanket restrictions on the freedom that I've just argued is extremely valuable of the press. And if we start to say, well, because you are in a position to be able to print the voices of this group over here and give them an epistemic platform, or because you're in a position to interview these politicians, or because you're in a position to do X, Y, and Z, you have a duty to do X, Y, and Z. What we're doing is basically infringing on that freedom to set editorial policy, which matters if they're going to be able to fulfill their democratic role. So I think we've got even bigger reasons for thinking we need to just try and find out if there's an agent, and if there's an agent that's done something specifically that can be held accountable, and not just go to these other sources of duties, however plausible some of us might find them. So what are the print press group? Well, I sort of gave you a prequel earlier by bringing Stephanie Collins up, but what I'm going to say then is that really we're looking for whether there's a group agent that could bear the kind of duty. Now, I think we would need to be able to identify basically a group agent of the press, a collective agent that's going to comprise on or supervene on the group of press agents in order to find some kind of body with the right kind of causal responsibility to say that they have the moral responsibility for the collective harms that have been caused, and potentially redressing or preventing those moral harms. But does such a group exist? Well, there's lots of ways that I could define this, and I'm well aware of that. So, but here I'm just going to use Collins's tripartite taxonomy of groups, partly because it's quite nice and clear, and also because I think that it's one when it comes to certainly this let's say the top level way in which she cashes out duties, I think is something that a lot of people will find plausible. So I think it's worth starting with that. So Collins suggests that there are three types of groups. First of all, there are collectives. This is the kind of thing that I'm looking for. A collective, a true collective, where they are constituted by agents who are united under a rationally operated group level decision-making procedure. And because of that, they have the potential to attend to moral considerations. So I said I wouldn't really argue for the existence of group rights, but group agents. But if you think there are any group agents at all, you might think what makes them a group agent fit to bear duties is that we can look at them and see they've got a clear decision-making procedure, and they act together in some way. Again, all these words are contested, and there are lots of different ways to interpret them, but I think that's the kind of top-level way of looking at it. So they have a group-level decision-making procedure, and this gives them the potential, Stephanie Collins says, to attend to moral considerations. So that's the kind I'm actually looking for. They're connected, as you see here. Secondly, there are coalitions. So these might be constituted by agents who each hold a particular goal and are disposed to work with others to realise the goal, but they don't have a group level decision-making procedure with the potential to attend to these kind of moral considerations. So in the case of the print press, I'll talk about them in a second, we might think they share a goal and they might be a coalition. And thirdly, you have these kind of combinations. So a combination, I'll come back to that with the social media part for the final part of this talk, but a combination might be constituted by any collection of agents that just don't together constitute either a collective or a coalition. So that would be literally any combination of agents that really don't look like they're connected in any particular way. They don't share a particular goal of any kind. Okay, so those are the three categories. And I think when it comes to the print press, the most obviously either looks like the random combination, but I'm going to say that they're not that, or it looks like it's going to be a coalition. So people do dispute the details of what kind of group can bear what kind of duty, but here I'm just going to go with Colin's position, which is I think many find reasonable, that's that the kind of group that can bear duties without any further collectivizing activity is going to be a collective. Duties are borne by agents, and group agents can be identified by having a decision-making procedure. But the UK print press don't appear to be any kind of structured collective agent. And for all the reasons that we've talked about, actually, individually, we want them to have the freedom to pursue their own editorial policy, to try and find out the truth, to speak truth to power, and so on and so on. So as a group, they are a wide range of distinct group agents who act independently in pursuit of all kinds of goals. However, what they do share in common is, according to what I've said, this goal of fulfilling their democratic duty, their democratic role as the fourth estate. So they all have that in common, but they remain distinct agents in pursuing it. So this introduces kind of two immediate concerns if we're trying to think about, is there a group that could hold responsibility? Well, not without some further arguments. So if we're saying that the only kind that uncontroversially can bear duties are these collectives, well, first of all, we don't seem to be able to allocate a kind of prima facie moral responsibility to this kind of agent, to this kind of group, this kind of collective. They share a feature in common, but each acts independently of the others. And if we do try and hold the collective as a whole, so if we do something like Watson does in her paper saying the print press have violated epistemic rights, well, it doesn't look like there's any way that we can actually reducibly allocate responsibility for the collective harm caused down to those involved, because they've all got their own specific intentions and decision-making policies and procedures, and they're not working together. So there's not this body that you can just go, oh, you lot, now you as an agent can go sort that out and figure out who's going to deal with this duty. On closer examination, I just think it sounds like it's going to be a bit of a problem. And so the implication is they're a coalition sharing the goal of delivering democratic duty, but that makes them not fit to bear responsibility for the harms, the collective harms caused. However, I think this is premature. Now, interestingly, I spoke really briefly with Dilara, and I think she wasn't entirely against this, but a lot of people have been when I say it, so let's see how you feel. I think arguably this is actually not correct. So I'm going to deal with the UK print press because that's the one that I know the most about. But there are features, I think, of groups of print press agents which make them more cohesive than that outline suggests. And so to understand that, understand why, we can examine the ways in which they view themselves and the role they voluntarily take on, generally to avoid state interference. But this is the role of regulation. So if we look, for example, at the print press agents in the UK, how they view themselves is best reflected in their own predominant self-regulatory body, which is called IPSO. So we have a central body which members of the press sign up to. Agents of the print press have collectivized effectively to form a decision-making group for the assessment and allocation of punishment. So when members of the press fail to adhere to things that are in the thing called the editor's code, then this body, this decision-making process allows for the print press to determine what they should do about that, and if they should be held accountable for that, and if they should pay some fines and all the rest of it. And so what I want to suggest is that the presence of IPSO and the presence of regulatory bodies and the presence of things like editors' codes that effectively set rules on the entire collective that the entire collective participate in provides strong evidence that the group of UK print press agents does believe that they share goals and participate in shared decision-making procedures. And what I think is that this is true not only in relation to complaints, but also in relation to the practices that they're expected to abide by. For example, if you look at the Editor's Code of Practice, it says it's the responsibility of editors and publishers to apply the code to editorial material in both printed and online versions of their publications. They should take care to ensure it's observed rigorously by all editorial staff and external contributors, including non-journalists. It's very clear that there's more going on here, I think, and I suggest that the presence of these kind of bodies and a shared commitment to an ethical standard and decision-making procedure in assessing violations of that standard means that groups of print press agents are in fact together a collective agent, fit to bear duties for collectively caused epistemic harms and so on. Now, they might not be a group agent in the sense of having a set of aligned goals in all respects, but certainly with regard to ethical practice and responsibilities, they've chosen to come together and form the kind of collective that could be held morally responsible. But I want to say something stronger than this. I actually want to say that it's not the press have chosen to come together in certain states. So I'm talking about the UK here, and they have IPSO and Editor's Code. This would imply that they could just self-disband it and there wouldn't be anything. What I'm saying is it's not really a choice insofar as you get to choose whether you come together and form this. What I'm saying is that the existence of these kinds of regulatory bodies and the existence of these kinds of rule books and decision-making processes that they combine together to come up with is a recognition of the fact that agents of the print press within a state share some kind of collective identity as a democratic agent of the state together. And so they recognize that in themselves. And so the implications of this would be that the print press within the state, taken as a collective group, bears the rights and epistemic duties of being the democratic institution of the press. And I think then we can say that we can hold this group accountable. So I'll leave this to the Q&A and flowers commentary, I think, but I think this then gives us a basis for saying there is an actual agent, not just sets of agents, that as a whole is responsible for the collective harms that the press cause. So I just want to turn now finally and very briefly to social media agents and say what kind of agents are involved here. Now, social media corporations play, I think, a very different role to that of agents of the print press. First of all, each one on its own is actually already a very large, powerful corporate agent that on its own could have the ability to cause significant epistemic harm if we thought they were the right kind of people who bore this duty, which I don't think necessarily are, but they have that ability. So Twitter on its own has the ability to undermine the epistemic rights of the citizenry if it wants to. It's such a powerful platform. You don't need to talk about press agents all saying the same things and combining together and their agendas being the same. You can just look at Facebook or you can look at Twitter. And arguably you can look at TikTok and some of these other sources as well and say the same thing. So it's not the case that they could only harm when their actions interact. So we don't need to be looking for this kind of collective body in the same way. But also very importantly, although they're the right kind of size of agent to do this kind of thing, the actual epistemic and consequent harms that come about through social media are not on the face of it due to the actions of these social media corporations in anything like the same way that the actions of the print press interact with society. Instead, it's the collective actions of the users of social media corporations. And some of those might be particularly powerful users, as with the former president of the United States, but most of them are just ordinary people. So individual social media corporations like Twitter and Facebook are clearly corporate agents, if anything is a corporate agent. But they don't even claim to be presenting editorial content. In fact, they actually actively argue that is not what they're doing. So they're not fulfilling that fourth estate kind of role that the press fulfill. But there's a lot of harm that comes about from them. But it's from the individuals. And the individuals don't form any kind of recognizable collective. We have combinations, maybe coalitions at best. You know, you have some people joining up together to pursue a common goal, maybe on Twitter, but they are random collections. And social media corporations kind of facilitate their voices. But here's what I want to say about this. I think that one thing that is true, and I argued this with Faye Nyker in the forthcoming paper, one thing that is true is that whilst social media corporations certainly don't have editorial production content responsibilities, they do have a facilitatory role. And they argue this themselves. You know, if you talk to, or if you look at interviews with Dorsey, for example, that's what he sees himself as doing, is facilitating the voice of the people. But what this means is that social media corporations have brought it about such that now it's not just powerful individuals that can cause harm when exercising epistemic freedom. Individual acts of epistemic participation, just tweeting, sharing, and liking, can collectively now come together to cause real harm. So what's happened is that social media corporations have become the facilitators of those voices, but in doing so, they've created a new, broader public sphere. And they've effectively taken on a role. They're the only people who can fulfill this role. They're the only people who could bring it about. They've taken on a role in democratic states of facilitating debate in the public sphere on a scale and in a way that could never have happened before. And all I want to say today, and all I'm going to say today, and I do argue this in the further work, is that I think what we might be seeing here is that there's something going on here that I think is potentially the emergence of a kind of fifth pillar of democracy here. So if we think that users not only have the right to accurate information, but they have the right to participate epistemically in a society, then what social media corporations have done by their very existence is bring into being an extension of that role on behalf of the state. And this might be the emergence of a new kind of democratic agent. It's not the fourth pillar, it's not like MPs, it's not one of those, it's something else. And so if that's the case, then we might think that they're going to start to have to think about the duties that come with that. I'm not going to say any more about that now because I've already talked for probably far too long, but that's what I think is going on. So ultimately, I think in the case of the press, what I'm saying is there's actually a group agent that can be held responsible for the things that are going on. In the case of social media, we don't need to try and claim that there is some kind of group agent, and it might look like there's no actual ethical responsibility for the collective harms caused by what happens on social media. But because of the role that social media corporations are starting to take on, they are actually starting to fulfill a democratic role, which might come with rights, but it might come with duties. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, the commentator will be Dilara Boğa. She's a PhD student at Central European University at Vienna. Yeah, Dilara.
Hi, hello. I hope you can hear me. Thanks again for organizing this. Thank you, Leon. It was a great talk again. I'm grateful to be here. I did my MA in Bilkent University, so I'm fairly kind of interested in the collective agency literature, although right now I'm doing more of machine ethics and kind of robot ethics in general. So, okay, so I have two issues that I want to discuss about Leonie's talk. First of them will be shortly about the point that can we consider the press as a collective, and the second one is about the distribution of responsibility. So let me start with the first one. So I'm still not sure that when we think about the press, that the whole distinction that Stephanie Collins makes between combinations, coalitions, and collectives, one might say that the press, the UK press, share these common goals, but not the decision-making procedure. But I have an intuition that the press, as the kind of the UK press, can have some level of decision-making and some kind of causal chain that can make it more united as a collective. But we might see that the Guardian or Telegraph, like other institutions, might have more united collectives, but doesn't, I think, doesn't prevent us to call the UK press as a collective. But on the other hand, when we look at the social media, for me, social media agents, they don't form any coalitions even, or they don't form any collectives of any kind, because maybe we can consider them as non-group agents with certain duties or responsibility. So in the literature, I'm aware that Bill was arguing for that point. So if we really care about this new kind of agents in the democratic societies to bear certain duties or responsibilities, I don't think that we should need to consider them as a group agents. My second point, which I'm more interested in, is about distribution of responsibility. So I was thinking, Leonie, maybe one might say that the users of social media are fully responsible, because after all, if we imagine the user of a Twitter, so this user have free will after all, and no one is forcing this user to tweet anything. So it is fully that it can be seen that it is fully their choice. Whereas if we compare to this for a soldier in an army, we know that some of the choices of the soldier is being taken away from him. So when the soldier kills someone, that we can know that the commander of the army itself will take some of the responsibility. But when we come back to the social media users, like Trump in Twitter, I think someone say that Trump is fully responsible, no matter fully responsible individually. So if we think that social media users are not like soldiers, I think this can kind of make us look back to the press. On the other hand, the mainstream media or the UK press, to me, seems like more like an army, because after all, if one of the journalists in Guardian publishes something, if it causes certain harm or not, then the editors can say that, or the Guardian itself can say that it is our own responsibility, so they can take some of the responsibility. So if we think about the whole social media point again, someone also say that maybe it is not fully Trump's or any other individual responsibility about their tweets, because after all, Facebook or Twitter are designed to in a certain way so that that can manipulate the users. But I think that point can be said for many things that humanity created. So if we think that the social media is something like a gun, so at one point in history, people created a gun, and this maybe some guns will be used for murders, but some of them will be used for just killings in the army. So are we gonna hold responsible for people who designed or who created these guns? But you can say that maybe social media is more sophisticated like that, and it is much more complicated. So I see that point too, because I'm interested in robot ethics. So there are lots of discussions about killer robots, whether they're responsible or not, whether the engineers who designed the robot is responsible, or the government, the state who regulating this, their use in army is responsible. But personally, for the social media, I see them as more like a platforms, like a public sphere, like a park or restaurants where people share their ideas freely. And if they cause a harm, they might be held directly, individually responsible. So thank you. I think that's all I can say for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Leonie, would you like to respond to Dilara?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dilara. I think there's a lot that I probably do agree with you on, actually, when you say some of these points. So that's terrific. Thank you so much for taking the time to read through the paper as well and talk with me about this. So I think we'll focus on just the second bit in particular. First thing I want to say is that I think nothing that I'm saying about the users of social media suggests that when you have powerful individual agents, they can be absolutely held responsible for the things that are connected to their actions, regardless of anything else. So when we think about Donald Trump, and then my basic argument is, and always has been, that actually there's fundamentally no difference between, I mean, I talk about persons, but we may as well say agents, between corporate agents and individual agents when it comes to who has duties and who has rights. What really matters is that you're not infringing upon the rights of another person exercising your rights as an agent or person of some kind. And so I think that powerful people like Donald Trump can and should just be held responsible, because we can directly attribute things to what they have said and done. So if you have a reach of X million on your own, and you have a particularly powerful voice, and that voice can infringe upon the ability for the people to perform as persons, then that's going to be enough in its own right. This made me sort of think more about the gun kind of analogy and stuff like that. And I think that the gun kind of thing is kind of how actually people have been seeing social media corporations, not putting it as well as you did, actually, with the idea of like, we've built a gun, like the gun's not responsible, it's the people who use them. I think what I want to say here, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to make it a bit clearer, is that individuals, like, so before the gun, like an individual could punch someone in the face, maybe, or something, or hit them with a stick, and it probably wouldn't cause much damage as the gun. So that's one thing to say. But then you give people these weapons of greater destruction, they can obviously cause more harm. So that's kind of the first thing. But in the case of social media, what we've given people isn't necessarily a gun in that sense. It's something that allows them to combine their guns with other people's guns, and to sort of create their own non-structured harms, even if they didn't intend those harms. So, for example, if I share a tweet that I'll say something sarcastic about some party or other, and or I put about a controversy, a conspiracy theory, say something like that. If I just tweet that, my individual action doesn't look like I have actually pulled the trigger on a gun and shot somebody. It looks like I've just sort of tried to punch somebody or do something like that. Maybe it's a small scale thing. So it doesn't look like it's such a big deal what I've done. But if then loads of people then also say the same things I'm saying, and if they start retweeting what I'm saying, I start retweeting what they're saying, then we all start doing these things together. We have absolutely then combined to create some kind of harm that we couldn't create when we didn't have social media platforms. And so one argument I might say is, as you sort of put it there, is that, yeah, that's not the social media platform's fault. They are basically just like a park or something like that where this is happening. It's not their fault. But I think you can actually take it a bit further and say, well, yeah, they are like that public sphere. They are like that kind of park. But if you think about it in there, what you have in a park is you don't just have everybody just running around being able to do whatever they want to do. There are rules and procedures around it, and there are people who are there to police that. So you might have that people can stand on soapboxes and say whatever they want in the public park. But you also have like then the park police. And actually this is an analogy, it's not mine, it's Jack Dorsey's. So this is something he says in an interview, and talks about the fact that their role is not, that he started to realize that the role of Twitter or something else is not just to provide the park and say, that's it, we provide the park. It's actually something much broader than that, because what providing a park means when that park didn't exist before is that you're also the people who are responsible for sort of mediating and making sure that people are not harming one another within that park. And so I think it's a bit more like that. And this is why I have this idea that they're kind of an emerging democratic agent, because before they came along, we didn't have those parks. You know, we had very different small little parks, ritual parks, and you know, you might have some people with powerful voices could go on the TV and talk, but you didn't have everybody being able to do this and to combine together so they could cause harm. So I think what this suggests is that it's not quite like they are just an inanimate weapon of some kind and that they're just putting about, that they've brought something into being, which means that they've extended existing rights that we might have had to speak our mind in such a way that they are the only people who can also regulate those rights and control those rights on behalf of the state. And that's bringing about some kind of emergent new role in a democracy. I'll probably just leave it at that, because I know that's enough for now, I think. Thank you so much, Dora.
Thank you. I have a bit of a follow-up, but I will wait until after we finish with the Q&A probably. I don't want to steal so much time. Thank you, Leonie.
All right, thank you. And if there are any questions, please use the reactions, the raise hand function, at the reactions part at the bottom of the screen. All right, Professor Ludwig.
Hi, Leonie. Thanks very much for that talk. Super interesting. I was wondering, though, whether we really need, in many of these cases of collective harms, to locate a collective agent of any kind in order to hold, as it were, the groups of groups responsible for the harms that they're causing. If we think about it on analogy with an unorganized group of people who suddenly realize that the things they're doing individually are jointly causing a harm, for example, global warming, once it's pointed out to them, it seems to me that we can call on them as a group to reflect on how the combination of actions which they are engaging in combine to cause a harm. And then each of them will have an individual responsibility to try to contribute to their collectively ceasing to cause that harm. And then we can extend that to the case not of groups of individuals who suddenly realize they're causing harm collectively, but to groups of groups, and then to groups of institutions of various sorts. So I think there's already a mechanism for holding responsible groups of press institutions without trying to find a collective agent per se, or any kind of structured agent. If there is a structured agent, of course, there's already an organization in place, so they don't have to collectivize, but it seems to me that the basic principles are the same.
Good, yeah, thank you. And I think that's a really good point. I don't think a lot of people would necessarily disagree, to be honest, with what you're saying there as well. So, so the idea would be that once you have a group of groups that recognize that collectively they're causing this kind of harm, then that itself gives them a source to do something to reflect on how that works. If we take it starting with the kind of climate change analogy, the main reason why I've gone down this whole route is to try and find the strongest basis for arguing for the duties, or the one that I think most people find most plausible. But I think there is.
I'm going to lay in bed.
Oops, sorry. Oh, sorry. Can you still hear me? Yeah. But I think there is something to be said for the idea that if you all recognize you're causing a harm and you have a duty to do something about it. But if you think about the groups of individuals, the challenge there for climate change is that individually, a lot of the problems seem to stem from the fact that we don't know exactly what we've done that's caused the collective harm. Individually, we just know that it's come about. So that's the argument that some people make anyway. So there might be some obvious things that we do, like maybe you should buy locally and not far away and things like that, but some of the things don't always come together. We don't always think there's a duty to collectivize from that, but that we should be more responsible individually because we can foresee our actions will contribute to a kind of collective harm. I think you can say the same kind of thing for the print press. And I think that seems very intuitive to me. You can say, okay, you will contribute to an epistemic collective harm if you tell a bunch of lies, and if everyone else tells a bunch of lies, puts about misinformation, you will cause these things. And so you do have these kind of individual duties to recognize that, to not pollute the epistemic environment in that way. And perhaps it gets harder when you think about some of the things that aren't obviously necessarily things that will contribute to epistemic harm unless literally everyone else does them. So I'm thinking there about things like just not including certain perspectives, or always pushing, explaining the perspective. Say you're, I mean, maybe I should do it from the other side of things. Say you're always just putting forward the position of trade union groups. You're there to put forward what trade union groups think, and you put that forward. On its own, that seems like a completely valid editorial policy for you to have. The problem would only come about if everybody else was also only ever expressing what trade union groups think and not what corporations think. I'm deliberately putting it this way to try and take out the obvious bias that I have towards things that are happening. Then it's not necessarily obvious that even if you want to avoid the collective harm, that as an individual group, it's clear to you what you should do about this, because you might think, well, actually the freedom that I have is to put forward an editorial perspective and to present the views of people I think are worth listening to and to do those kinds of things. It would seem like a bit of an infringement, a big infringement, to say you've now got to start publishing the views of corporations. Why doesn't some other press agent do that? And so then the claim starts to be, well, actually what you've got to do is kind of bring yourself together as a collective and agree who's going to put forward the voice of the corporations if you're all doing this, and so on and so on. And that's when I think it starts to get harder to say it's obvious that you have a duty to do that without necessarily infringing on the freedom of individual press agents to put forward the editorial positions they want to put forward. So that's what I think some people might think and argue. And so because of that, it does just get a lot easier if we can say, look, there is actually though an agent that we do have to hold responsible, and that there is already accepting that responsibility as a central decision-making group to ensure that they're not polluting the epistemic environment in this way by only putting forward certain views and so on. So I think that's where I'm coming from. In all honesty, I'm probably much more sympathetic to the other kind of view, but I'm not sure that everybody would be, and I think that it might worry people in terms of how individual agents, individual group press agents are supposed to manage that. I don't know if that answers it, but that's probably what I'm thinking. Thank you.
Evrensel?
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I believe that social media agents can be collectives, and the reason why I believe that is because I see trolls as being, for instance, a collective agent in social media, and sometimes trolls are also utilized by governments as well, and they can also cause significant harm when they act together. So, I mean, firstly, I wonder if you agree that trolls are collective social media agents, and then if they are, or maybe even if they're not, do citizens who use social media, which are a significant amount of them, have some collective duties, like collective democratic duties towards trolls to, in a way, stop them, or, I don't know, share their own and try to circulate more accurate news and those sort of things?
Oof, that second one's quite interesting to think about, actually. I'm just going to put that to the back of my head for a minute and think about the first part of that. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, so interesting, like groups of trolls. So I think whether I think they're a collective or whether I think they're a combination is going to come down to how organized they are and what they're trying to achieve. So if they just all share the common goal of just destabilizing things, you know, they just like causing chaos, for example, or something like that, which, you know, that was the original idea of trolling, was just to upset things, really. Then I wouldn't say that I agree they're a collective agent, because I don't think they've got a sort of central decision-making body, and they're agreeing who's going to do what and how we're going to do this. If you have like subsets of people who literally gather together on 4chan and say, let's set up a central body, and these are the rules of our group, and this is how you troll, and I expect these things to go on, and I'm certain, actually, I've been really trying not to say his name too much, but you think about the former president of the United States, and I think there are some groups who were acting in these kinds of ways in terms of how they collectivized what they were putting out through various channels. And actually, on the various less extreme perspectives, you have dissemination groups that are deliberately set up within political parties, you know, to deliberately troll the opposing parties' threads, for example, on Facebook and things like that. So it does happen. Well, they would be collective agents, you know, if they've got a decision-making body and you can identify that, then yeah, absolutely. And I think if you can say, and this group did this harm, and we can point to it, they're as responsible as any party would be. But generally, in terms of just trolls taken together, I think they're more like the combination type thing. And usually, if we're using Stephanie Collins' tripartite distinction. I've just seen Steph's face now. Sorry, just realised she's there. So if we're using that, I think that, I mean, that's where I think they would fit. And yeah, that's probably where they fit. The second bit about what citizens' duties are towards trolls, I think that's interesting. I don't know what I think about that, because I'm not sure that. So again, they're not together. I think they look like random collections of individuals. I think that perhaps we all have responsibilities not to take part in epistemically bad practices that are going to pollute the environment, epistemic environment and stuff like that. But I think that might be as far as I'm willing to say it goes. And that's why I think actually it's probably the SMCs like Twitter that are going to have the duties to deal with that. So I think that's probably what I think. But it's certainly something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Sade Hormuy.
Thank you, Leonie, for the talk. Great. I just want to push you a bit on the agenda setting thing that you were talking about, British press and migration and asylum seekers, right? And how the kind of percentage of people who thought it was a very important, or one of the most important issues just kind of came down. And it's like, of course, it's like partially like what the media is, you know, setting the agenda, but it's also like comes like the kind of agenda that other people are setting for it. In this case, really much like, you know, like the Brexit thing. And then there was also the 2015 events with the amount of refugees from Syria. And, you know, it was like kind of everywhere in the news anyway around that time. So in 2016, it was there. And, you know, that was also, so somebody could even argue that those were the kind of main causes, you know, that the refugee crisis was well stopped at Turkey, and then, you know, Brexit happened. So some people thought like, well, we got our way, and now we don't have to worry about these Polish plumbers anymore, you know. So, you know, because it's not just like, it's kind of like, and especially when there's groups of agents that are kind of subscribing to the same ideology, you know, then like the politicians and the media is just more, different kind of media is more likely to pick up on different kind of messages from the politicians as well, right? So they're kind of setting the agenda together. And then also they problematize the idea of like that you need this range of voices in media, because of course you do, but also this kind of the idea of the neutrality of media by portraying different voices has also been exploited, for example, by the climate change lobbyists. Like, you know, for a long time there was always that these denialists that as much media time and airtime as the scientists who were actually doing climate science, for this idea that, hey, we're giving a range of voices a go, even though in that case it was like the percentages were totally crazy, that 3% gets this amount of you know, media exposure against 97% of the scientists. So, you know, those kind of things are also like, so there can also be other powerful epistemic agents that are affecting the agenda of the media. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Sally. So, yeah, so in terms of the specific agenda setting with the Brexit and asylum seekers and the change in terms of that, I think that's fair. What you could say, so there is actually a perfectly reasonable debate with that specific example about whether the media was following what people were interested in, or whether the media was setting the agenda and which direction it was going in. And I think I would accept that. And so I think that it's fair to say that might be what's going on. So maybe when the media just stopped printing as many articles going on about asylum seekers and started switching to the terms of the EU post-Brexit, that just made sense because that's where people were at. Yeah, I think that's probably reasonable to say. So I think what I'm going to do there is probably just appeal to the thought that I think there's a lot of things going on. So I think at least one of them is the agenda setting power of the media. The idea that the media can set agendas and does set agendas is not, you know, a new idea. It's something that we actively want them to do a lot of the time. I think they do. So when they pursued like the Watergate scandal and things like that, they were pursuing an agenda that wasn't on the public agenda that we did want them to pursue. So I think it's recognizable that it is something they can do, that we do want them to do sometimes, and they do. And there's much better research than anything I would present about how effective that is and under what circumstances. And I know it's a lot more complicated than just they say, talk about this, now you all think like this and stuff like that. So I think what you're saying is completely fair. And I think it's probably more complex than a simple graph like that would show. So maybe take that as me trying to illustrate the idea rather than the specific example maybe. But in terms of, I said a bit about plurality of voices. No, I think that's right. I think that's right as well. So I think that if we think that the press as a body has a democratic duty to, what do we think in terms of epistemic rights in Ireland? I'm not totally convinced by the idea of epistemic rights, but to preserve the epistemic environment so that we've got more truthhoods, fewer falsehoods, that people know about things that matter to them, to their lives and that are important. That would derive the extent to which you should be hearing these alternative voices across the set of the print press, for example, across the set of the media. So just because there are voices that argue, so the 3% who might argue that climate change is not caused by human intervention and so on. If you go by the weight of the scientific evidence, then the epistemic duty would not be to give them 50% of the voice and to give them that, it would be to give them 3% of the voice. It would be to say, look, we're not a totalitarian state, so people can dissent, people can say these kinds of things, but it would be to say that like somewhere that voice is being heard, but it's at this kind of level, not the way it was presented in like the BBC ideas of impartiality, where they literally just every debate you have a denier and you have somebody who's a scientist working with the body of what scientists actually think. So I think that's kind of how that gets pulled out in the wash, really, that it's not just, there's not a simple duty that all voices have to be heard. It's that the duty is that the epistemic environment has to be clean, as healthy as possible, something like that, in very vague terms. And as a group, as a decision-making body, you have a role in ensuring that that is what you're trying to put about. And that's probably what I'd say about that. And I'll stop saying more because I'm running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are out of time. However, Stephanie Collins has a question, and since her views were important in the talk, so then I think we should listen to her before our break.
Are you sure? Okay. Gosh.
Yeah,
okay.
I think so, right?
Okay. You're the chair. Okay. I'll try and be quick. So as you, I think we've talked about this before, I'm not really convinced that media outlets are constituent parts of IPSO, at least in the way that I characterize collective agents, because I think members of collective agents need to be able to act on behalf of the collective of which they're a member, and I'm not sure that the Sun can act on behalf of IPSO, for example. I mean, it's a legal empirical question, I guess, but I wouldn't have thought that's possible. Anyway, putting that to one side, I just wanted to flag that I still have that concern. Putting that to one side, I don't see how IPSO having the duty to make the epistemic environment clean isn't going to ultimately infringe media outlets' freedoms in exactly the kinds of ways that you were worried about if we gave the duties directly, you know, under the kind of Kirk's proposal where we give the duties directly to the outlets themselves. Because surely IPSO is going to then need to somehow regulate outlets more in ways that are going to infringe their freedom. So can you say more about how giving IPSO the duty doesn't infringe freedom in a way that giving the duties directly to the agents problematically does infringe press freedom?
Yeah, you're good, thank you. And I did wonder if someone might say something about that, actually. So I think that it's less about giving IPSO the duty and sort of saying that IPSO is a recognition of the fact that they are a collective body who can make decisions together and do that kind of thing. And so because I sort of disagree with the first part and think they are effectively constituent parts of a collective, then I'm going to say so they, as the members of that body, are effectively deciding it between themselves rather than IPSO telling them this is what you do. So that's probably the way I'm going to go on that. I won't say, I'm only going to not say any more just because I know that we need to keep this quite quick, but I'm obviously going to go in that direction, but that's going to depend on the disagreement I have already about whether they form parts of this collective group. So that's the answer that I give.
All right, thank you very much. Let's thank Leonie one more time.